I gotta be honest, I think Tourette syndrome is pretty funny. Whenever I see someone with like hardcore Tourette syndrome in a documentary, say, they're always people with a great sense of humor and they're surrounded by people with a great sense of humor. Which unfortunately is because you need a great sense of humor to deal with this disorder. But that is a massive oversimplification of the situation, so let us do a deep dive into the thing. Big Tourette's fact number 1. The most common symptom of Tourette's is not the thing that you are most prone to seeing in the media. Copolalia, aka talking shit, because that is literally what the word copolalia from the Greek translates to, is actually a fairly rare symptom. The most common symptom of Tourette syndrome is actually excessive tics. But what even really is a tic? A lot of young children actually do have tics. It's a fairly common thing to have, though usually they go away as childhood progresses. A tic is a nigh uncontrollable urge to execute a certain physical movement or series of physical movements, like touching your nose, or patting your head, or maybe doing this. The thing that's very often misunderstood about tics is that they're not entirely involuntary movements. They're not automatic like your heartbeat, and they're not reflexive like breathing. People who have Tourette's to a certain extent do make a choice to execute these movements whenever they do execute them. But the question can be posed as to whether or not it is really all that voluntary if the urge to execute these movements is so absurdly overwhelming. Imagine you have your hand on a hot stove and it's burning your skin, and you have the urge to pull that hand back, obviously. That is how strong the urge for these people is to execute these movements. So very often they will feel these tics coming on, they will feel the urge to execute them, and then just let it happen because not doing it is essentially mental torture. This is called a premonitory urge, and for most people who have Tourette syndrome, especially with tics that they have very often, they don't really think about the transition between the urge and actually executing the movement because it's just become such a habit. This means that they can actually, to a degree, sometimes suppress these tics over a certain time frame, which many of them do. However, this is on one hand incredibly mentally straining and can distract your attention from whatever task you might actually be doing, and also it generally leads to a sort of build-up of pressure that must then be released afterwards by sometimes really just excessive fits of having tics. There's also a comparison to be made with a restless leg syndrome, which I found out firsthand you can actually also have in your arms. People with RLS, especially in situations where they have to keep their legs or arms still, which is, in bed most of the time, it'll feel like, imagine your legs are trapped in concrete, and like really trapped in concrete. You cannot move them even for a millimeter. It is completely and perfectly sealed. Are you getting the urge to move your legs to break free from this predicament? That's what people with RLS have. Of course, they can move their legs freely, they're not actually caught in concrete. But unlike Tourette tics, which usually have a certain pattern to them, this is just trying to alleviate a certain sensation. It's not the exact same thing. Some tics are more common than others, and really every individual person with Tourette syndrome will usually have their own set of tics that can vary in frequency and complexity wildly. They may also change over time, like one tic you might have for years and then it disappears, and it might even come back later. A new tic might be introduced, or sometimes you will have the urge to execute a movement like a tic, but it'll only happen once in your entire life and you'll never get that urge again. It is a very complex disorder. Also, for a lot of people, they will have more tics or more instances of the tics, or they will be more intense when they're extremely excited, like when they're stressed or very elated. And the thing is, there's actually a lot more people who have some level of Tourette's than you might think. Like most neurological and psychological conditions that are incredibly complex, Tourette's exists on a spectrum, and about 1% of the population does have some level of extremely mild Tourette's. So you almost definitely know at least one person who has some level of symptoms. However, the 1% number is a bit of an estimate because most people who have these symptoms don't bother going to the doctor with it. I know this because I myself have several Tourette symptoms. I have a huge amount of tics. If you watch my live streams, you probably will have seen quite a few of them. I do like this, with my arm all the time. And I will wiggle my eyebrows in a weird way, accompanied with the wiggling of my ears. I will do this with my nose. Sometimes I will, with my legs, I will also contract those in the, what do you call the inside of the elbow? But it's for the leg. But also, what do you call the inside of the elbow? And even though I am in therapy for unrelated reasons, I barely have tangentially talked about this with my therapist because it really doesn't interfere with my life at all. I have a lot of eccentric idiosyncrasies. This is not the one that's gonna sink my ship. Like, my triceps is gonna contract from time to time. Big fucking deal, especially considering that I can easily suppress it by just doing something else. Right now that I am making this video, I don't really feel these strong urges coming on because my mind is distracted. Sometimes they will break through, but most of the time they really won't. And this is useful when I am doing things that require fine motor skills, like doing surgery on a grape. Oh god. That's a really old meme. I guess it just sort of slipped out. The thing that we see most in media as the portrayal of what Tourette syndrome is the coprolalia aspect of it. Literally, when I was a teenager, I thought that talking shit was just what Tourette's was. Turns out it's actually extremely rare even among Tourette's cases. About 10% of patients have coprolalia symptoms. However, I am not surprised that this is the thing that media tends to focus in on because it is the most interesting aspect of Tourette syndrome. Coprolalia is tied to the same tic-like urges that the motion tics are, but they tend to be a little more complex. I mean, don't get me wrong, most people who have coprolalia will usually stick to a certain set of phrases, most of which are usually offensive, much like people who have these tics will usually stick to a certain set of tics. But sometimes it can get a bit more freeform. Nobody knows why this is, really. There is a popular theory that posits that the brain essentially gives high priority to impulses coming from a part of the brain that is tasked with judging how socially acceptable things are. It's like you see just a random woman on the street, right? And a part of your brain goes, you know what would be really socially unacceptable right now is to call that woman a fucking cunt. And then some other minor part of your brain goes, but it would be funny. And then the whole rest of your brain goes, no, it really would not be, please stop. But the system is wired up in a way that this but it would be funny impulse just overwrites everything else and you get this overwhelming urge to say this thing, much like you get the overwhelming urge to lift your hand off a hot stove. And voila! You've just called a random woman on the street a fucking cunt, you've just called your black neighbor a nigger, and you've told a random kid that just walked by that you're gonna murder it. As you can imagine, this can very easily lead to some really problematic situations, which is why people with coprolalia among sufferers of Tourette syndrome have the most trouble functioning in everyday society. This is sometimes alleviated somewhat by a certain shift in the tone of voice or accent even, when you have one of these verbal tics. And also very often they experience motor tics at the same time. It'll usually sound quite weird. There's also been cases of people who speak in another language, provided they speak another language when they have their vocal tics. You'll just be in a random conversation with a person, and they will just not comment on what just happened, not because they didn't notice, but because it's just normal to them. And this sort of odd behavior does give you a clue as to the fact that their behavior may not have been entirely voluntary. But especially when it comes to racial slurs, if you live in a culture that is racially charged, which thank God I don't live in such a culture, things can go bad very quickly. Especially if you also have OCD, which Tourette's is very often comorbid with, and you need to repeat the thing that you said a certain number of times in order to achieve the set that you are comfortable with. And you can't do anything else before you're finished, because that would be also torture. This comorbidity can become especially tragic if you suffer from the kind of OCD that makes you just clean things all the time, because this, combined with the tics, can very easily send you into a fit of actually doing damage to yourself physically, especially your skin with chemical burns and stuff. because a lot of cleaning equipment can be very toxic. Tourette's is also comorbid with various attention deficit disorders and also to a lesser extent depression. However, that's probably not so much because of the Tourette's itself, but because of the living situation that Tourette's can create. There is no known cure for Tourette's. Sometimes in very severe cases, people are giving neurosuppressant drugs, and behavioral therapy has been shown to work. But especially with the drugs, the side effects can sometimes just not be worth it, and people who have Tourette's, if it's not too severe, will usually just learn to live with the condition. And the best way of doing that, especially if you have coprolalia, is by having a good sense of humor. Not just you have to have a good sense of humor, but the people around you also need to have a good sense of humor, or at least understand on a visceral level that the things that you are saying are not actually things that you mean. Very often people who have more freeform coprolalia will find themselves surprised at the things that they themselves are saying, because it's a thing that comes from the subconscious, and often find it hilarious. I once saw a documentary of like a Scottish man who had Tourette's, and he went to a self-help group, and a big part of that self-help group was just them hurling insults at each other and laughing their asses off. And the thing is, not only is Tourette's in no way degenerative, meaning that you will not have a reduced lifespan or reduced intelligence, it is in fact the case that Tourette's correlates positively with high intelligence. Yes, that's right. Smart people are actually more likely to have Tourette syndrome. There's actually some elements to the disorder that many sufferers have described that can be quite beneficial for intelligence. Like, for instance, many have a certain increased attention to detail, like a spatial awareness that makes them able to pick out things more easily. Some are better at free-form association, which can be very useful at problem solving. There's a lot of highly intelligent and successful people who have Tourette syndrome. Ethan Klein from H3H3, he has Tourette's. You can see it very often in his podcast, sometimes in his videos. Tim Howard, probably the best football player in America, definitely the best goalkeeper in America, has both Tourette's and OCD. Similarly, Jim Eisenreich plays Major League Baseball. Samuel Johnson, one of the most influential intellectuals in the Anglophone canon, probably had Tourette syndrome. Nick Van Bloss, world-famous pianist, Tourette syndrome. Steve Wallace, NASCAR driver, also has it. Actor Dash Myhawk has it. Phenomenal performance on Ray Donovan, though ironically, his brother was the one with the Tourette syndrome. There's a comedian called Sam Comroe who has it. Slavoj Žižek, probably the most influential philosopher of our time, though never officially confirmed, probably has Tourette syndrome. And before you complain about the lack of women in this list, even though first described in a French noblewoman, Tourette syndrome is actually 4 times more likely to occur in men. And many women who have Tourette syndrome will have symptoms that are very much closer to an OCD diagnosis. OCD and Tourette's are just really closely related. The thing is, I don't know that any of these famous and successful people with Tourette syndrome are particularly prone to coprolalia. Probably on one hand because the symptom is very rare, but also because it's the most problematic one. Especially in an age where everyone always has their feelings hurt by everything, I fear that we might be regressing from an acceptance and understanding of this particular symptom of Tourette syndrome, because I feel like a lot of people just aren't willing to understand that maybe something that you said isn't the thing that you meant. And that is, of course, if you have coprolalia, that is the big one. It actually took some time for me to understand this as well, because after all, the impulse still comes from the person's brain, so isn't it really the person saying the thing? But there's so much filtering and decision-making going on in so many layers of your mind that if you only see the end result, you can easily just assume that they're faking it to get away with saying things that they shouldn't be saying. Everyone has intrusive thoughts. You have had intrusive thoughts. I have had intrusive thoughts. I have them every day. And the thing is that with people who have coprolalia, very often they can't control them. And as for the causes of Tourette syndrome, nobody knows. Another factor that makes things difficult is that Tourette's can only be diagnosed symptomatically, like there's no MRI check or blood test that can demonstrate that you have Tourette's, though there are several tests that will be done over the course of a diagnosis of Tourette's to rule out other disorders. It does seem that it is inherited to some degree, but the genetic factors at play here are incredibly complex. There's a popular theory that Tourette's is like a genetic misfire from an ability to have more free-form association or to perceive things with a higher attention to detail, which are definitely things that would give you an evolutionary advantage. Many quote-unquote inherited disorders happen exactly this way, where there is something that gives a small benefit, evolutionarily speaking, that is wired up incorrectly, and so it misfires, and so you get problems. I mean, this thing in here inside the skull is a massively complex machine from the nano to the macro level that unfolds and builds itself like a whole tree out of a plant, and it comes with a whole body attached to it. If you understand all the inputs and outputs, if you account for those, you could even say that the entirety of the neural network extends throughout the entire body and interacts with every single factor of it. It's a miracle that not everyone has Tourette's all of the time. There are so many things that can just be slightly miscalibrated in a system as complex as the neurological part alone of the human body. And even these slight miscalibrations can lead to errors that have massive consequences. And really, I just feel like that's part of the beauty of how many different kinds of humans there are. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you have gained a bit of a deeper understanding about Tourette syndrome and the people who have it, and maybe developed a little bit of compassion for them also. Like, comment, subscribe, do all the things, share this to your relevant communities, do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or following me on le Twitter. In that spirit, I appreciate all of you. If you have experience with Tourette's, please do leave it in the comments. I am genuinely very interested in hearing what you have to say. Have a phenomenal day, week, and year, and see you around, cunts.